Okay. Look, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tom Lewis today. Tom presented to us back in July. He talked about the finding of the propellers of the USS Perry up in Darwin. So he's no stranger to us. And I was just trying to count the number of books he's written. He's I'd definitely say prolific author now, because we're just talking about that. He's produced over 20 books have been published. Now, he's had 3 careers. You probably read his biography. A career in the RAN, mainly doing intelligence analyst work, but then also teaching, but more recently, obviously, the last 30 years, he's been an author and historian. So welcome, Tom. His presentation today, again, is a very controversial subject in a lot of ways. So I don't think he's going to talk just about the heroism of think under Robert Rankin and HMAS Ron Taylor, but he'll talk about the honours and awards system and some of the difficulties we have with that. So over to you, Tom. I'll just ask everyone to make sure they're muted, and then we'll get on with it.
Thanks very much, and welcome everyone. They do say you shouldn't start with an apology, but I think I will, because I'm aware of the background of many of you people in that you're experts in your field. Having said that, I sort of went, well, should I take the story of Yarra as having been written, and you all know it, so forgive me for a few slides which summarise it. And if there's anybody new out there who's never heard that story before, it's obviously a magnificent one. As you can see, lots of books published, and I would say that, am I still in PowerPoint? Yes, hopefully that's progressing. I have been arguing this point since 2001, that people like Rankin and Taylor have been under-recognised. Back in 2001, I was teaching at the Naval College, as was mentioned. I started off as an intelligence analyst. I was a high school teacher, and I'd published about 4 books. I did one on the submarine outside Darwin, the I-124, and was an intelligence part-timer, and got rang up one day and asked if I'd like to teach at the Naval College, having a teaching ticket. And having been tortured down there myself, and knowing what a wonderful place Jervis Bay was, I said, yes, I was interested, and was duly moved there with a 3-month-old baby, and we lived in one of the houses behind the wardroom. And it was an interesting 5 years. Eventually, I said I wanted to go back to intelligence, the war against terrorism hotting up, and that was my specialty, counter-terrorism. So off I went, served in Iraq, East Timor, and so on. I led an American team in Iraq, which was a bit odd. Then other postings around the world and Australia and so on. Eventually got out, went into military history full-time and did some more full-time teaching. Moved to Canberra last December and feeling the cold. It's 3 degrees tomorrow night. And so renovating the back garden, but it gives me more time to move into more military history. And I was discussing before, I'm working on a book called Bombers North, about bombers out of Northern Australia in World War II, one called The Steel Ship, Life and Death on Cruisers such as HMAS Sydney in World War II, and Cyclone Tracy and the ADF history, which will be published at the end of 24. But back to this, I remember in 2001, I think I was talking to Andrew Corley at the college about the fact we had Rankin's medals, I think it was, and his sword. Nothing was had ever been done in terms of recognition for him. And I was also, apart from military history, English, I was a computing teacher, and I wrote a website. It was called Rankin VC, ? And you sort of send out, have a look at my website, chaps. And lo and behold, here we are 20 years later, Rankin still hasn't got a decoration. So I have waxed lyrical in those 3 books on the left there. The Teddy Sheean book has been printed by 2 different publishers under 2 different names, the first one before his VC and the second one after. But both of them do have an extensive chapter on the final action of Yarra. And I won't be going through the whole thing in detail yet, but if you're after footnotes, if you're after sources, and that sort of stuff, and the detail of these actions. Those are the books that contain them all, as well as Heck Waller's gallant final stand on HMAS Perth. They were used as examples of the Navy has been mistreated in terms of honours and awards in World War II. And I would dare say in other wars as well, although the subject gets bigger and bigger. I'm probably becoming boring and an irritation to some people out there, and that I don't shut up about it. But I think it's a noble cause. It's a worthy cause. And we campaigned, when I say we, I was just the biographer in the background, although I'd make a speech to somebody given the drop of a hat. But Gary Ivory and Guy Barnett MP in Tasmania were the main proponents of the Sheean cause, and eventually got there. I made submissions to the inquiries. But anyway, back to these worthy chaps. On the screen there, top right, you can see Rankin. Bottom left is leading seaman Taylor. And I argue that both of these blokes should have been given bravery medals, gallantry medals. And look, I went down the road of VCs, but I encountered considerable opposition about VCs. And I think we were pretty fortunate to get Teddy his. And it's ironic that these chaps performed similar actions. I argued then in the books that they and Waller, and I've argued in other places for other people, were worthy of VCs. But when you go down that road of retrospective VCs, you do get considerable opposition from Army people, RAF people, RSL people, all sorts of odd people. But at the same time, you get Army, RAF, RSL people arguing, yes, you're right. I'm a bit aware that if you argue for a job lot of VCs, you've got no hope at all. So I think the VC road is probably very thin now for people like Rankin and Taylor. But why have they ended up with no decoration at all? There's Ron Taylor, a typical chap from Melbourne. I dare say halfway down the screen, he was very embarrassed now about being the mascot of the sloop Marguerite, age 7. But obviously very interested in warships from an early age, and good on him. And he served in a number of ships, as you can see there. And he's a typical member of the Navy in World War II. One of your hard-playing, hard-working young men, and they were men, at sea, who made up a terrific force for Australia. Rankin, more detail, because he was in the Navy for longer, a lot longer, and you can see there what he did. By no means a standout, sterling, wonderful officer. If you want one of those, read John Collins' biographies. There are several of them, and I've written a chapter on John Collins, which has appeared in various places and will come out next year in the Steel Ship. John Collins was the sort of bloke who got 8s and 9s on his personal reports out of a possible 9. Rankin's not the same, but he is a sterling officer in many respects. The unusual thing is, down the bottom there, he's a surveyor. And yet this is a bloke who's in command of a warship, and a real warship, not a tiny minesweeper or something like that. He's in charge of a warship, a fighting warship, and he goes to his death in that warship. So what a surprise for him, and the toll it took on him and his family life, considerable. In World War II, he went off to serve overseas. Before that, great photograph that, so I thought I'd have to include it. And part of the sadness, I suppose, of him dying. It's called Oscar. I don't know why, what the relationship is there. Maybe somebody can explain Robert and Oscar. His wife thought he was called Oscar. And as war looms in the 1930s, and of course we've got that symbiotic relationship, or that mother-daughter relationship with the Royal Navy, and a very worthy one too. He's sent off to Britain, and he's tied up with surveying. his daughter Patricia's born. He didn't see much of her in his life, sadly. And then he then gets appointed to be first lieutenant. And as most of you know, the first lieutenant's job is basically running the ship. Anyway, resource is concerned with the med in the main. He gets good reports. There's resource for you. Odd job for him. And eventually he serves until the end of 1941, getting shot at a lot. If you study up on the med, most of you would know that it's a pretty full-on action over there. And eventually he then gets sent back to Australia to do, strangely enough, some surveying, as he does. And then he gets appointed to Yarra, and there's Yarra. The term sloop isn't used anymore. There's a description up the top there. They're not badly armed. In fact, was it Swan was the most heavily armed ship in Darwin when the Japanese arrived, and defended herself with vigour. And unlike Peary, who I was doing a talk on some months ago, Peary was sunk. They're not a bad ship, but not if you come up against a Japanese flotilla. So then Yarra has basically been off doing noble things in horrible places in the Red Sea, and lots of contact with Italian surface and air forces and German, and does very well under Lieutenant Commander Harrington, who later became a Vice Admiral and who commanded her with distinction. In Iraq, lots of adventures for the chaps, and they basically had lots of small ship adventures, if you like. Harrington, at the end of this, is given the Distinguished Service Order, and he very much deserved it. Now, of course, Rankin isn't on board Yarra at this point. She's posted to the other side of the world at the end of 1941. And this is after the Tobruk ferry operations and so on. As you can see there, lots of little ops. So ordered back to Australia, and never makes Australia, is arriving in Singapore. And Rankin has been sent up to join the ship. And it's maybe a measure, and I did explore a little bit of this in what I could find in documents. It's maybe a measure of Rankin's lack of command background in a warship, that he doesn't relieve Harrington straight away. He's on board for several of these operations. And in one of them, leading seaman Taylor is singled out for keenness and courage. Lots of nasty little actions against particularly Japanese air assets in that time. And of course, this is overshadowed by the loss of Repulse and Prince of Wales, who Guy Griffith I was talking to the other day was on board and escaped from. So she has lots of small convoy operations. There's lots of Japanese aircraft activity. And in the end, Harrington hands over to Rankin, and Rankin forms the final convoy. And the final convoy is very small. It's only 3 ships, and here's one of them, Ankin. And she had hundreds of personnel on board. I was actually going through my notes the other day, trying to work out how many people died in this action. It's several hundred. There's a lot of people here, and I don't have a list of names. On Yarra herself, I think it's 138, 138 men cleaning down with Yarra. So it's pretty nasty. Then you've got Frankel, it's a small tanker, and you can see the diagrams there of them. And you've got a minesweeper. Now, just draw your attention to the bottom right paragraph. It looks like the minesweeper slowed this convoy down, and you're only doing a maximum speed of about 8.5 knots because, as most of you know, you keep the convoy speed to the max speed of the slowest ship. Now, if that hadn't been the case, you could argue this may not have happened. The Yarra final action may not have happened. They would have been fast enough to have not been in the area when the Japanese were. But anyway, Yarra actually picked up 2 small boats the day before, ship's lifeboats, a lot of this submarine activity around. And eventually, 4th of March, early in the morning, lovely day apparently, everybody had a good breakfast. They see this enemy smoke on the horizon, and they start seeing the tall superstructures of these enemy cruisers. And there's one of them to your right there. This is an absolutely hopeless and horrible situation. You just look at the weight of broadside there. That is ridiculous. Yarra's really got not a lot of options. She can run at 8.5 knots. I suppose you could abandon the minesweeper, but even so, it's nothing compared with the top speed of these cruisers and destroyers. You can turn and face the enemy, and that's what he did. You can make smoke as part of that. That's what they did. And really, your options are limited. You could surrender, I suppose. That's not something that's not in the lexicon of quite a lot of these operations in World War II. You could argue that surrender might have been a better option, but that's not Rankin's job. Rankin's job is defence. I don't think in the book of what you can do it says surrender. So he did what he had to do. He turned and faced in the first turbo command of a warship that he had in his life as a surveyor, and he did what naval people do. He fought to the end. The action was, there's pages of this. I went through and I looked at who hit what, and action by salvo almost. Yarra basically fought, and she gave her everything that she put in everything she could. Whether she actually ever hit one of the enemy warships, I don't know. It doesn't seem that she did, but she just fired to the end. Yarra was now battered wrecked with almost everything flammable on fire. The act of Taylor and any of his gun crew remained was incredible indeed. It seems his pride and hatred of the enemy far exceeded his own need to live after abandoned ship had been given. He was last heard to say, "This gun is still firing while I've got a breath in my body." The destroyers ceased fire about 9:30, so about an hour and a half max. By this time, they've actually been hit by not only the ships, but also the float planes. The cruisers carried, some reports say, up to 3, and they joined in and bombed. The 4 ships of the convoy are sunk, and most of the people on board die. Rankin probably died in the second salvo. Taylor stayed at his gun. The abandoned ship order was given by Lieutenant Commander Smith, the first lieutenant. He was the only officer still alive, and he gave orders to abandon ship. 2 Carly floats were flung overboard. 33 men jumped into the sea. Smith was not amongst them. An enemy destroyer approached it off at 200 yards and pumped gunfire into the sloop. Some of the ship's company were picked up by the Japanese. So it's sort of rather odd that this action simply disappeared it was reported in Australian newspapers. It wasn't picked up by anybody, and it wasn't reported on in terms of some sort of honour and awards needed. Over the other side of the world, previously, you find things like this, the Jervis Bay action, where a convoy is defended by a sole escort, very much outgunned, and it fought to the end. And in different circumstances, some of the convoy escaped, which it didn't happen with the Yarra group. But Fogarty Fegan, who coincidentally once served in Jervis Bay itself, down south of Sydney, at the Navy base there, the Officers' College, was awarded the VC, rightly so. And there at the top is a photograph that somebody took of him being bracketed. So why do you get actions like this? And then you get, for our Navy, no reward at all. Well, the Navy's treated differently to the RAF and the Army. You've got to process the awards in Britain, not Australia. And that adds a lot of difficulty. Britain's fighting for its life. You've got nobody there who says, I'm the Aussie representative and I'm here to argue for it. There were Australian Navy people serving in Britain, yes. But you also have added to it the fact that that's part of the game. Naval actions are more out of sight of witnesses. Sometimes you get an action where, in the case of HMAS Sydney, all 645 people died, and you can't really sort of single people out for individual bravery because there's no witnesses left. But Britain is hardly thinking of the empire at this time. You could argue that she should have been, but she's fighting for her life against a relentless submarine campaign carried out very effectively by the Kriegsmarine. And of course, you've got Britain in 1940. So, as you can see on the slide, you do have a fairly chaotic situation in the RAN. Collins, for example, and I did document this, examined his own records and said, well, these are ridiculous. It looks like I stopped the war in, I think he said the end of 1941 or something. This was in 45. And he said, if my records are like this, and by this time he is the fighting officer of the best known member of the RAN in World War II, you'd think his records would be okay, and they weren't. So he said, what hope is there for other people? And exactly. It's nobody's fault in many ways. There is a chapter in one of the books called Malevolence or Incompetence. And I argue it's really neither. It's just a small force that expanded 300% from 12,000 to 40,000 by the end of the war, enormously. And there weren't enough people or 75-year-old captains being brought back to do desk duty in Sydney. And a lot of stuff wasn't done that should have been. The trouble is, you could argue, well, it should have been done after the war, but it should be done now. Anyway, to continue, post-war, you just got this, let's wind everything down. And it's, we've had enough of war. We want to beat the swords into plowshares and go for peace again. And you get people like Waller, for example. Eventually, somebody in the RN said, your chap who went down fighting on board HMAS Perth, his counterpart on USS Houston was given their highest award, the Medal of Honor. Your chap's been put forward for nothing. Would you like to do something? And somebody in the RAN says, oh, thank you very much, Royal Navy, for noticing. Let's do the paperwork. And he got a mention in dispatches. A notable distinction, a notable award, but not a Victoria Cross, the only other posthumous award possible. So there has been the 2000 tribunal. It was really not put in place to argue whether things were done justly or morally right. It was put in place to see if the admin procedures of the time were followed. And it did its job. They were. It's just that the procedures weren't very good. They weren't fair, is my argument. For example, look at the Admiralty, who actually did give somebody something for their service on Rankin, which was sunk. Our Navy didn't. So even after the war, it just gets pushed back and back and back. The Navy's the smaller service. There's a lot of wrongness there. It was maladministration, as the tribunal found. But the trouble was the procedures at the time weren't really fair either. So even though things might have been done properly, you had very little hope of things like a VC. So that's what the tribunal found. The trouble is that that's nothing for Taylor and for Rankin. And as I referred to previously, you could almost say that the irony of the Sheean campaign has overclouded things for people like Rankin and Taylor. Now, they're not the only people who I would argue have been done badly by. That's badly phrased, isn't it? Routinely, the RAN has not received what it should have. Look at Francis Ems, action, a ship's cook manning a machine gun, and fighting even though injured until he died almost, died later that day. The lack of administration in terms of people like Waller. I've just published Attack on Sydney Harbour, and in that I argue that Bode of the Chicago, Captain Bode, and Muirhead Gould, who was commanding Sydney Harbour's defences, basically behaved badly, behaved with incompetence on the day the midget submarines attacked Sydney. Not one of those small ship commanders was ever given anything except a letter of commendation. That's hardly a medal or an honour. And what's worse, Bode, who shot himself later for incompetence at the Battle of Savo Island, and Muirhead Gould were allowed to continue. I think our chaps are very hard done by. there. You find oddities such as Warwick Bracegirdle, gunnery officer of renown, who received 3 DSCs, a DSC and 2 bars, as did Stanley Darling. Oddly, down the bottom there, only one conspicuous gallantry medal I could find has been awarded for the RAN in World War II for that particular action there in a British ship. So there were those higher, of course, not posthumous, and a lot of chaps seem to have missed out. Although the George Cross cohort for mine warfare in Britain, I think, were well treated. Maybe it's because they were in Britain. It's a lot bigger Navy, there's a lot more people to do paperwork. I don't know, maybe that's the reason why. Stanley Darling, who commanded not only a destroyer of several destroyers in World War II, but also Sydney Hobart yachts after the war, he also received effectively a DSC and 2 bars. Something higher, perhaps? So, there's a mistake there. Has Rankin been rewarded? You could argue, of course, that Rankin was rewarded by naming a ship after him. But Taylor, and we just heard from Gary Taylor, Taylor hasn't been. Most Australians don't know who Ron Taylor was, and they should. And how are they ever going to know unless there's some sort of gallantry medal given? Now, what's to be done? There's what's to be done. That's a screenshot from this morning. You simply go to the website, it's an honour, and down the bottom there, you can start the process of recommending bravery awards for people like these people. And if not us, who else is going to do such things? Now, you might think that that's a big ask, but look, it's a form. I was a branch chairman of the Order of Australia Association for Northern Territory. I think I was standing up when the music stopped. Order of Australia recommendations are not routinely put into Government House. There's not a lot of them, especially in the smaller states. And anybody can be nominated for an Order of Australia by another Australian. There's plenty of people out there who can receive it. There's a military category for an Order of Australia. But it looks like a lot of people, they're quite enthusiastic, and then they say, oh, that's too much. I don't know how to do it. I've filled out, I've campaigned effectively for 3 people to get an Order of Australia who eventually got it. It does take 18 months to 2 years, but it can be done. You do need to supply evidence, and you do need to supply referees. But the evidence, I would argue, is in the books that I've written. I'm not sort of, you could send them a copy of the book, I suppose, but look, it's there, and I'm quite happy to supply PDFs that you can copy and paste from. So, in conclusion, what I'd argue is that there are various awards that could be made for Rankin and Taylor's individual bravery. The Victoria Cross Avenue might be too difficult, but there's different bravery medals. There's various things that could be suggested. Sometimes you simply suggest, and it's left up to the committee at Government House, which is very well run, to start processing that. I recommended Rankin and Taylor for an award over a year ago, and I got back my email. In August, I wrote to them and said, how's my campaign going? Oh, I'm still under consideration. They do the job properly. They've got people who research to make sure the right people are being awarded. It's not specious or wrong, or they've got some sort of dubious past. And it is, you could argue it's cloaked in secrecy, but it's possible to do this. You simply start the process. And I'd suggest that if more people do it, then more of the Navy are going to be rewarded. So there's other RAN members, and look, it's Rankin and Taylor are the 2 standouts from Yarra, but there are other ships company members who I think should have been nominated. And there are other people who could be nominated for things in World War II. I just mentioned Francis Ems before because he's an odd one, EMMS, a ship's cook on board a small ship in Darwin Harbour. And he's an example of an obscure small ship mention, and I threw it out there because it's an example of there are these people who deserve commendations. So what I'm suggesting is fill out those forms. Go to the It's Not a website and let's see what happens. Over to you if you have questions.
Tom, thank you very much. Yeah, you've certainly got the message through that we should be all contributing to the nomination process. But thank you. Look, I'll just open it up for questions. If anyone has one, you can unmute yourselves and ask the question. Actually, mine, Tom, came out of the early stages of your presentation with Rankin being a surveyor. I would imagine early on in the war, there was probably a shortage of warfare officers and possibly a surplus of surveyors. So hence the postings to command jobs.
Yeah, he actually, when he came back to Australia after they gave him the job of doing a survey of, I think it was the northern part of Sydney Harbour. I found it, and it's got his name on it. And he got, I think it was 3 months or something, and he met up with his family again. And then suddenly he gets told, off you go. Yeah, surveying is such an important job, isn't it? But yeah, how many charts around Australia have still got surveys from 100 years plus on them?
Yeah. No, thanks. Other questions?
Looks like I've covered the ground.
Yeah, no, excellent. Actually, the one point I would add, and I think Gary Taylor missed it, that down at the recruit school in Cerberus, there is a division named after Ron Taylor. So I guess that's not publicly known, but certainly within Navy, most sailors going through the recruit school will know all about Ron Taylor.
Yeah, and you do get things that I think are not known. When I was at RANC, we started renaming the classrooms, which were interestingly named Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, etc. And sort of somebody one day said, well, why don't we call them after people of renown? And one of them, I recall, was named after Chief Petty Officer Rogers, who served on board Voyager. I think that may have been transferred down to Cerberus, and they went through another process of naming them. But good on them. I actually have a paper, and I published a paper. I've written a paper recently which asks, why do we persist in naming ships after obscure things such as capes and so on? Why we only have 7. We have 7 ships named after people. Jules is the other one, and an interesting chap. So you've got the 6 submarines and HMAS Jules. Let's name more ships after our people of renown. The Americans do it all the time. I was serving in Baghdad, and we had to shoot every week. We carried our weapons everywhere. It's the height of the war, and they made us good on them. The ADF made us shoot every week. The Americans didn't get such practice, so we used to get in an armoured bus or a Humvee and go off shooting at a range. And the range I was at was renamed when I was there. And I said to one of the Americans, I was embedded with him, who's this bloke? Oh, he's over here. And they had a little plaque around the corner. It was a laminated A4 sheet. And they just named that range after a bloke who died the previous year in Iraq. He was a sergeant, I think. And I thought, that's different. What is it with Australians? Well, don't we like our own people?
David, Peter Poland here.
Yes, Peter.
Mike Colton has just published a book about a number of ships. And if you look at those stories of those ships, there would be a lot of people in there who should have got some form of honour. And you could probably go around everywhere and find people. And it's a shame that these people weren't, which particularly the incident didn't get recognised, but you know, it is a problem. You get a lot of, what was it, Vendetta did something like 30 trips in and out on the Tobruk ferry run. A hell of a job.
Yeah, the scrap iron, that would be the scrap iron flotilla. Yeah, I read it. Good on him.
No, Tom, thank you. You're obviously very busy.
Yeah, I sort of alternate between, now we've moved south to Canberra gardening. But anyway, I chucked the email address out there. I should have put it on the last slide, talewillis@bigpond.com. But I am interested in hearing stories from World War II, HMAS Sydney, and other big ships. Not unfortunately the corvettes, unless it's something small like manning an anti-aircraft gun, which is pretty much the same if you're manning a 20 mil on one of those or a cruiser. And obviously interested in Tracy stuff as well.
Once again, thank you very much on behalf of everyone. It's been a pleasure and informative. And hopefully everyone does continue to make those nominations.